"Don't go home, Terry. It's dangerous." My grandmother's voice, trembling with worry, sounded like a whisper on the other end of the phone, but the fear it contained echoed in my ears like a scream. As I was about to get into my car in the cold, dim parking lot of my office, I froze in place. My heart was pounding like a bird pounding against my ribcage, each beat a throbbing sound in my ears. My grandmother Agnes would never call me at this hour, especially this late at night. Especially not with such tangible, palpable terror in her voice. I opened my mouth to ask, to understand what had happened, but the words were stuck in my throat. But she repeated breathlessly, as if she were racing against time, "Trust me, Terry, please, just trust me. Go somewhere else now, don't go near your house," and before I could say a word, she hung up. The click of the phone hanging up cracked like a whip in the eerie silence of the parking lot. I placed my hand over my heart, as if this would slow her down. My grandmother's warning blared in my head like a siren. My mind whispered that it might be an exaggeration, but my instincts, and the part of me that knew my grandmother, knew it was deadly serious. Following her advice to the letter, I steered not toward my house, but toward my close friend Alan's house, which lived a few blocks away. My mind, all the way there, had been a maze of potential disaster scenarios. Grayson? It was the first and only name that came to mind. What had he done again? About an hour, maybe less, after I arrived at Alan's house and had given him a cursory account of the situation, I heard those sounds, cutting through the night like a knife. The blaring sirens of fire trucks and police cars, first distant, then growing louder, had transformed the Milwaukee skyline into a war zone. I ran to the window, filled with an indescribable pang of distress. In the distance, in the direction of my street, the sky was painted in ominous orange and red. Black smoke billowed into the sky like a beast's breath. And then I knew. The source of those flames was my home. That little haven, a haven filled with memories, every corner of which I had toiled and sweated for years, was being consumed by the flames' relentless dance. I don't remember how I rushed barefoot onto the icy sidewalk. I didn't even feel the sting of the cold. All I felt was a fire searing through my chest, a fire hotter, more devastating than the flames that had engulfed my home. Before my eyes, a part of my life, my work, my dreams were turning into rubble. I watched helplessly as the fire consumed everything, one by one, reducing my memories to ash. A single name, a single face echoed in my mind: Grayson. My unstable, troubled little brother, whom I had rejected just that afternoon when he asked me for money for another project. Of course, I had no proof, only a searing wave of anger coursing through my veins and a bitter certainty gnawing at my soul. I don't know how I drove to my parents' house, how I got there. I only knew I was dying to confront them, to demand accountability for this betrayal. They exploited them, this family that fed their parasitic son, that family that covered up his every mistake, and as I expected, they protected him, as always. My mother's voice was soft, as always, but this time it was steely. "Don't make a big deal about it, Terry. Family comes first." But not this time. I vowed that this time, I wouldn't let their blinding love and injustice silence me. My name is Terry Henderson. I'm 35, and I'm an electrical engineer living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm not usually one to complain or whine, but if you ask, I'll tell you my life story, completely naked. My life is like a poorly written book, full of plot inconsistencies. I'm the oldest child in this family, and that meant always having to bear the burden, always having to make sacrifices, but never receiving the recognition. My family, or rather this structure we call family, is a tangled web of favoritism, injustice, and deep wounds that never heal. My father, Stanley, was a retired welder, an old-school patriarchal man. He constantly bragged about his own glory days and how hard he worked, but when it came to his youngest son, Grayson, he was completely blind. In his eyes, Grayson would remain that innocent little boy who needed protection and affection, even if he set the world ablaze. My mother, Betty, used to be an intensive care nurse and now works as a school nurse. For her, this was a lighter job, allowing her to better care for my grandmother, who was in a wheelchair. My mother is a sensitive and kind-hearted woman, but she has a weak will, easily manipulated by my father and Grayson. Whenever I tried to mention this blatant injustice in our household, she would sigh deeply and utter the famous line, "Grayson is still so young, Terry. He needs your help more than you do. Young? How could a man nearly 30 be considered young? And Grayson, my little brother, he's a walking nightmare. He's 29, a pain in the neck, who's never held a steady job in his life, lives off our family's money, and constantly brings trouble and problems home. He's been pampered since childhood, given his every whim. I vividly remember my mother buying him the latest sneakers while I walked around in old, tattered shoes, or my father patting Grayson on the shoulder and telling him he was proud of him for kicking a football in the yard when I was 16 and working part-time after school to support the family. Grayson is aggressive, selfish, and utterly ungrateful. Whenever he gets into trouble, gets into a fight, gets into debt, or goes on a drunken rampage, our family always finds a way to blame circumstances, society, his friends, sometimes even me, but never him. There was only one person in this family who stood by me, who understood me, my grandmother Agnes. She was over 80, frail and confined to a wheelchair, but her mind remained razor sharp. She had lived with us, my parents, since my grandfather's passing. Although she never said it outright, I knew she saw and understood what I endured in this family, the injustice I endured. As a child, on those hot summer afternoons, she would sit me at her knee and tell me stories about my grandfather. She would tell me how hardworking, patient, and how he always put his family first. Then she would look me in the eye and say, "You're just like him, Terry." "You're my pride," she would whisper, but I never felt valued or proud of anyone in this family. She was my lighthouse, the only light that illuminated my path through my darkest, most stormy days. My family lives in one of those typical middle-class neighborhoods in Milwaukee where everyone knows each other, but no one interferes in anyone else's business. My house, a few miles away, was small, but the tangible product of years of hard work, sleepless nights, and endless overtime. I loved that house not just because it was mine, but because it was a haven where I could escape the suffocating shadow of my family, a haven where I could finally be myself, a place to breathe. But Grayson, fueled by jealousy and an unquenchable resentment, had destroyed that haven, that world, in a single night. This tension between me and Grayson wasn't new. It was like an insidious fire that had been smoldering since childhood, flaring up from time to time. I remember having to give up my toys, my favorite foods, even the praise I deserved for my academic achievements for him. When I graduated from college with a degree in electrical engineering, my father simply nodded. "Good," he said, "but don't spoil it." But when Grayson dropped out before even finishing high school, they'd comforted him, saying, "He'll find his own way." His way was gambling, drinking, and calling me begging for money whenever he was in trouble. I tried. God be my witness, I really tried to be a good big brother. I lent Grayson countless times, knowing he'd take the money and spend it straight away at casinos or bars. Deep down, I harbored a foolish hope that one day he'd change, grow up, and stop seeing me as an enemy or a source of money. But every time I helped him, he dismissed it, even mocked me. That's what big brothers are for, right, Terry? They always find a way. I'm not rich. I've just worked my butt off to build a stable, debt-free life. When he showed up at my door that disastrous afternoon, his face was redder than usual, his eyes wide as if he were on a drug. He supposedly needed a few $1,000s for a new project. I knew his project perfectly well. It was the same stupid, endless cycle of gambling debts I'd financed countless times before. I looked him straight in the eye and for the first time in my life said with absolute certainty, "No, Grayson, not this time." His face immediately darkened, his lips curling down in a snarl. "You'll regret this." "Terry," he growled, and slammed the door so hard the walls shook. I was used to his temper, his threats, but that day there was something different in his eyes, the ferocious glint of a cornered, wounded animal. I hadn't imagined his threats would become so swift and so devastatingly real. It was freezing cold that afternoon, that typical late-autumn Wisconsin chill that penetrated my thin jacket and seeped into my bones. I had just returned home, exhausted after a long, grueling shift at the construction site, overseeing the complex electrical systems of a new building. My little house at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by vibrant red maples, was my only haven of peace in this chaotic world. But that day, that peace would shatter into 1,000 pieces. When Grayson arrived, he pounded on the door as hard as if he were going to break it down. When I opened the door, I found him there, his hoodie disheveled, his hair tangled, and the familiar, pungent smell of alcohol clinging to him. "Brother, lend me some money. I have a big project," he said in a casual, nonchalant tone, as if he were asking for the time. I sighed deeply and started to slam the door in his face, but he put his hand between the door and the frame and pushed with all his might. "Stop being so smug, Terry. I need the money now." "What kind of project is this that always asks for money?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. I'd heard that phrase, that lie, dozens of times before. New project, big opportunity. But it always ended with Grayson disappearing for weeks, only to return even deeper in debt. He grinned, walked in uninvited, and flopped down on my favorite couch as if it were his own. "You don't need to know about this. Just give me the money." I stood there, fists clenched, fighting the rage that welled up inside me. My tiny living room suddenly felt stifling. The mementos on my shelf caught my eye. The faded photo of me fishing on Lake Michigan with my grandfather, the engineering degree I proudly hung on the wall. They reminded me of everything I'd sacrificed to get to this point. And here stood my little brother, Grayson, who knew nothing, who thought he deserved everything, as if he were waiting for me to hand it all to him on a silver platter. "No, Grayson," I said, my voice unwavering in determination. "Not this time. How many times have I helped you? What are you doing with that money? You're gambling, you're drinking. Do you think I'm a bank?" His face went dark. He jumped to his feet and wagged his finger at me. "Who do you think you are, Terry? Perfect big brother. You have a house, a job, and I have nothing. You're hindering me when you should be helping me. Don't blame me after what's about to happen to me." His voice rose to a roar, echoing off the walls of my small house. I saw my neighbor across the street peering curiously through the curtains, but I ignored him. I simply stared into his bloodshot eyes, searching for any sign of that little boy I once loved, that big brother. But all I found was pure anger and hatred. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice cold and emotionless. Grayson growled, kicked the coffee table leg, and slammed the door behind him. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard it couldn't fit in my chest, feeling like I'd just been through a major battle. But I had no idea the real battle had just begun. After Grayson left, I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. I wasn't physically afraid of him, but the hatred in his gaze sent shivers down my spine. I knew how unstable he was, that he'd been in bar fights and arrested for disturbing the peace. But setting my house on fire, I never imagined he'd go this far, that he'd become so monstrous. I reached for my phone to call my mother, but then stopped. What would my mother say? "Grayson's just going through a rough patch, Terry. Don't blame him." My father would probably say, "As a big brother, you need to be more forgiving." I'd heard those words so many times throughout my life, and each time they made me feel even smaller, even more worthless in my own family. I decided not to call. Instead, I opened a beer from the fridge and stared out the window. Night had fallen, the dim yellow streetlights illuminating the scattered maple leaves blowing in the wind. I thought back to our childhood, to those rare moments when Grayson and I had gotten along so well. I remembered the innocent smile on his face when I gave him my brand new bike, which I'd worked overtime for a month to buy, and his words, "You're the best big brother." But that smile was long gone, replaced by jealousy, resentment, and a constant stream of unreasonable demands. The vibration on my phone pulled me from my memories. It was my mother calling. I hesitated for a moment, but then I answered. "Terry, what did you do to upset Grayson so much?" Her voice was reproachful, as if I were the one causing the trouble, again and again. "He called me and said you never helped him. You kicked him out. You're his big brother. Why aren't you taking care of him?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Mom, how many times have I helped him? He promises to change every time, but what happens? He wastes the money on gambling and alcohol. I can't go on like this anymore." I heard that familiar, tired sigh I'd heard hundreds of times on the phone again. "Grayson's had a hard life. Terry, he's not as strong as you. You have to help him." I wanted to shout at him that I'd had a hard life too, that I'd sacrificed the best years of my youth to provide for my family, but I stayed silent. "I'm tired, Mom," I said simply, and hung up. My dad called right after I'd spoken to Mom. "Terry, don't be so stubborn," he said, his voice as harsh as ever, as if commanding. "Grayson is your brother. He's struggling, and if you don't help him, who will? Family comes first. Don't let a little money thing drive a wedge between us." I almost laughed, but it turned out to be a bitter, bitter laugh. A small matter. I'd given him money from my hard-earned savings countless times, and each time I knew how it was squandered at the gambling tables and bars. I didn't answer. I simply hung up, my heart feeling as if it were being squeezed in a vice. I threw the phone on the couch, pacing back and forth, trying to shake off the burning anger in my chest, the feeling of injustice. Outside, the late autumn chill of Wisconsin seeped through the windows, chilling me to the bone. Vivid red maple leaves were scattered beneath the streetlights like a warning of impending disaster. I opened the back door to the garden, letting the cold air hit my face, extinguishing the fire in my head. But Grayson's hateful gaze, the image of him angrily slamming the door and walking away, kept coming back to me. So vividly, so vividly. "You'll regret this, Terry," he'd said. I'd known my little brother had a temperamental, impulsive streak since childhood. He'd often threaten me if I did something he didn't like, but threats were one thing. Putting them into action was another. I told myself I was probably overthinking things. Grayson was as angry as ever. He'd calm down, then return a few days later begging for money, and I'd have to fight the battle to tell him no. I returned to the couch, picked up the now warm beer can, and forced myself to relax. But my mind was a jumble. I thought of my grandmother, Agnes, the only person in my family who had always seen the injustice I was enduring. As a child, she had told me, "You're so strong, Terry, but being strong doesn't mean you have to endure everything forever." Her words were a beacon guiding me through my darkest days. I wanted to call her to tell her what had happened, but it was late, and I didn't want to worry her at this hour. The next morning, my mind heavy as lead, I dragged myself to work. I'd barely slept because Grayson's threats had been playing in my head like a tape recorder all night. The engineering office was noisier than usual, with the monotonous hum of the printer and the voices of my colleagues discussing a new project. But to me, everything seemed to be shrouded in fog. I sat at my computer, staring at complex circuit diagrams, but I couldn't focus. The numbers, lines, and wires seemed as jumbled and meaningless as my current life. A colleague, Cynthia, tapped me on the shoulder. "Terry, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," she asked. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a little tired." But deep down, I knew this exhaustion wasn't from work. It was the exhaustion from the bleeding wounds my family refused to acknowledge. After work, I walked to the parking lot, the evening chill cutting into my skin like a knife. Just then, my phone vibrated, tearing me from my suffocating thoughts. My grandmother's name appeared on the screen. My heart raced, and a terrible feeling washed over me. I answered, my voice trembling. "Grandma, is something wrong?" "Terry, don't go home. It's dangerous." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was so shaky that it was clear she was trying to suppress her fear. My blood froze in my veins. "Grandma, what's going on? Did Grayson do something?" I asked, unable to suppress the panic in my voice. But he repeated, even more urgently, "Trust me, Terry. Go somewhere else now. Don't go home tonight." And then he hung up, before I could ask any more questions, before I could demand an explanation. I stood there, my head spinning, the phone clutched in my hand. My grandmother wasn't one to panic or exaggerate. If she said he was dangerous, something truly serious was going on. But what? What could Grayson have done? What could he have done so wildly? I wanted to call him again for answers, but the urgency, the commanding tone in his voice echoed in my head. I knew I had to listen. I texted Alan, a close colleague who lived a few blocks away. "Can I stay at your place tonight?" I texted quickly, my heart still hammering in my chest. Alan replied immediately. "Of course, brother. Come here right now. My door is always open." With nothing but my car keys and my phone, I jumped in the car and drove off into the night. The quiet streets of Milwaukee flashed past the window like a film reel. The dim streetlights cast an eerie glow, as if they were telling me some dark story I couldn't yet grasp. I tried to remain calm, but that uneasy feeling clung to me like a shadow lurking somewhere nearby. When I arrived at Alan's house, he opened the door, his hair disheveled and his eyes still sleepy. "Why are you wandering around at this hour?" he asked, his voice sarcastic but also concerned. I nodded. "Family matters. I just need a place to get away for a bit." Alan didn't press me further. He simply tapped my shoulder and ushered me into his small apartment. The faint scent of brewed coffee filled the air, and the cozy-looking room had an old couch in the corner. "Get some rest. We'll figure everything out tomorrow," he said, and he returned to the bedroom, leaving me alone in the living room. I lay down on the couch, but I couldn't fall asleep. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head like an ominous prophecy. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. I tried to imagine what could have frightened him so much. What could Grayson possibly do? Was he going to trash my house? Or was this just another empty threat, as usual? I thought I was probably exaggerating. Maybe my grandmother was just overly concerned. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't say such a thing for no reason. Wouldn't experience such fear. I tossed and turned on Alan's old couch, which creaked with every movement. Even the faint scent of filter coffee from the kitchen couldn't soothe my restless mind. The streetlight filtered through the curtains, casting hazy, flickering lines of light onto the ceiling, as if hinting at a story I couldn't yet fully grasp. My grandmother's trembling, urgent voice echoed constantly in my head, refusing to let go of the uneasy feeling that gnawed at me like a worm. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. But every time I felt like I was drifting off, my home would come to mind. That house I'd spent years sweating over, filled with countless memories and experiences. That faded photo of me with my grandfather, that walnut chair I'd crafted, that old engineering book, its corners curled from repeated readings. These small, seemingly insignificant things were my entire world. The thought that Grayson could do something that would shatter that world gripped my heart like a vice. I told myself, no, he wouldn't dare. He may be aggressive, but he's not a monster. Or had I always underestimated him? And then, like a knife piercing the deep silence of the night, the shrill, piercing sound of fire trucks and police sirens shattered the silence sharply and relentlessly. The sound, like a horrific symphony, jolted me out of bed, my heart pounding wildly, as if it were about to burst from my chest. I ran to the window and pulled back the curtains. In the distance, in the direction of my street, red and blue lights flashed one after another, plunging the entire neighborhood into daylight. Thick, black smoke billowed into the sky, mixing ominously with the intense red glow of the flames. The hair on my back stood on end as I realized that the smoke was rising from my neighborhood. My house was burning. I don't know how I bolted barefoot from Alan's house, down the icy sidewalk, and ran toward the flames. The late autumn Milwaukee wind cut my face like razors, but I felt nothing but fear and a rising tide of anger. By the time I reached the top of my street, I was frozen, paralyzed. The flames were devouring my house with a ravenous, insatiable appetite, and black smoke swirled through the sky like a vast, ominous monster. The acrid, guttural stench of gasoline filled my nose and burned my eyes. Firefighters shouted at each other. Hoses spewed massive columns of water, but the fire never let up. The front door, where I'd stood that afternoon to greet Grayson, was now a charred, warped frame, warping in the heat. Neighbors had gathered around, some recognizing me and whispering among themselves. "Terry, thank God you weren't inside," someone said softly, her voice filled with pity. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman, gripped my hand tightly, her eyes tearing up. I heard a strange noise, then I saw the smoke. I called 911 immediately, but the fire spread so fast. I shook my head, my throat tight, unable to speak. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't go home, Terry. It's too dangerous." If I hadn't listened to her, if I had been inside, the very thought of it was enough to freeze my blood. I stood there, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, watching those wild flames roar, engulfing my home, my world, the world I had built with my sweat and tears. That faded photo of my grandfather on the shores of Lake Michigan, that wooden chair, painstakingly crafted, piece by piece, that engineering book, its corners curled from countless readings, they all vanished, one by one, in that black smoke and red flame. Every crack, every piece of falling debris was like a knife thrust into my chest. But the deepest pain wasn't the loss of the house. It was the raw, brutal betrayal of someone who was my own flesh and blood. I knew Grayson had done it. I could feel his hatred in every flicker of the flames, as if the fire itself were his rage, relentless, unrelenting, and devastating. The suffocating stench of gasoline combined with his threatening words, "You'll regret this, Terry." Everything came together like fragments of a terrifying nightmare I couldn't wake up from. A firefighter, his face blackened by soot, grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back. "Hey, it's too dangerous in here. Stay away," he shouted, his voice piercing through the roar of the fire. I wanted to scream, to dive into that inferno, to save every single fragment of my memories from the merciless grip of those flames. But the firefighter stood like a wall between me and my burning house. My body was frozen, but my heart was pounding like a marathon runner, and my eyes were burning. I couldn't tell if it was the smoke or the agony that tore through my chest. The police had cordoned off the area, their red and blue lights flashing into my eyes as if mocking my helplessness, mocking a 35-year-old man who had watched his entire life turn to ash. I stumbled back to my car, my hands trembling as I held my phone, my fingers flitting across the screen, but I was afraid to call anyone. I wanted to call my grandmother and scream that she had saved me, that I was alive thanks to her, but my throat was so constricted, it felt like someone was suffocating me. Hot, thick tears welled up, but I bit my lip and held them back. I couldn't cry. Not now. My grandmother had always said I was strong, but in that moment, amid the ruins of my own world, I was nothing but an abandoned, lost child. Anger, pain, and betrayal surrounded me like that black smoke that clung to every breath I took. By the time the flames were temporarily brought under control, their intense red glow had given way to a thick, choking black smoke. Firefighters, sweating, stood amidst the smoldering debris, examining the charred remains. Police had cordoned off the area with their red and blue lights, their flashes glaring down on the shocked faces of neighbors. I stood far from the ruins of my house, but I could still feel the heat of the fire licking at my skin. A stern-faced man in a reflective jacket approached me. He introduced himself as Tom, a fire inspector. His voice was low and professional, but his eyes were sharp, as if they could pierce the very depths of my soul. "You own the house, don't you, Terry?" he asked, opening a small notebook, pen ready to write. I nodded, my mouth and throat dry. "Yes, I do." Tom studied me closely, his gaze as if trying to determine if I was lying. "Did you leave the stove or any candles on?" I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, I didn't leave anything open." "Was there anyone else at home?" he pressed, his pen dragging across the paper. "I live alone," I answered, each word hitting me like a knife in my chest. "I wasn't home tonight." Tom frowned as he took more notes. "Weren't you home? Why?" I hesitated for a second, the image of my grandmother filling my mind, her trembling voice on the phone. "Don't go home, Terry. It's too dangerous." I took a deep breath. "My grandmother called me," I said. "She warned me not to go there. She said there was danger." I didn't dare say more. I didn't dare say Grayson's name, but that name burned hotly in my mind. Suspecting something was one thing. Accusing someone without proof was quite another. I didn't want to seem like a madman slandering his brother. Tom stopped writing and looked at me intently. "Did she warn you? Did anyone have a reason to hurt you?" His question hit me like a punch to the heart. Grayson? His name echoed in my head. I wanted to scream that name, but I kept quiet, swallowing the enormous lump in my throat. "I'm not sure," I said, my voice trembling like a coward. I knew the truth, but without proof, I was nothing more than a pathetic man who had lost everything, standing before the ashes of his life. Tom nodded, his eyes still sharp, as if he knew I was hiding something. "Okay," he said. "We'll look into it. The smell of gasoline is strong in here. This wasn't a natural fire. Call me if you remember anything." He handed me a business card and went back to where firefighters were still clearing stray embers from the rubble. I stood there, watching the shafts of light flicker like leering eyes through the ashes. The smell of gasoline lingered in every breath, confirming the painful truth I'd known all along. Grayson had done this. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't fate. This was pure hatred fueled by gasoline and rage. Yet I had no proof, only pain and rage seething inside me like a volcano ready to erupt. I walked back to my car, my hands trembling and clutching my phone. I needed to talk to my grandmother to find out exactly what she'd seen, what she'd heard. My heart pounding, I dialed her number, and the phone picked up on the first ring. "Terry, are you okay?" His voice was trembling but filled with concern, as if he'd been waiting all night for this call. "I'm okay, thanks to you," I said, my voice hoarse, the tears welling up again. "My home is gone, Grandma. Everything is gone, all of it." I heard her gasp, as if she were afraid of it but hoping it wouldn't happen. "Grandma, how did you know? What did Grayson do?" I asked, my voice trembling, trying to remain calm. But I felt like my heart was breaking. She was quiet for a moment, then she spoke slowly, her voice calm. "I heard him at home tonight. He was muttering to himself, cursing you, saying he'd pay for this. I was pretending to be asleep, but I heard every word. Then he called his friends, said something about getting gas. I wasn't sure, but I had a feeling. I couldn't leave you in danger, Terry." Her voice cracked, as if she were suffering with me. I gripped the phone so tightly it felt like the blood in my veins had stopped flowing. "Gas, Grayson. The pieces fit together razor sharp." "Thank you, Grandma," I said, my voice trembling, tears finally streaming down my cheeks. "You saved me." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. My grandmother had seen the truth, saved me from Grayson's deadly wrath. But the price had been my entire world. My home, my memories, all of it reduced to ashes. The anger inside me wasn't just a flame anymore. It was a mighty storm, swept away all logic, all common sense. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, hurtling toward my family's house, where Grayson had absorbed them like a parasite. The familiar streets of Milwaukee blurred past the car window, but they felt foreign, like they weren't mine anymore. The smell of gasoline was still in my nose, mixing with my grandmother's words. He was talking about getting gas. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to face Grayson, look him in the eye, and make him confess everything. But deep down, I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of my family who would protect him once again, making me the villain of the family. My family's house was bright and warm, a cruel contrast to the smoldering ruins of my life. I pushed open the door without knocking, the smell of smoke still seeping from my clothes, my eyes bloodshot with both anger and pain. My mother was sitting in an armchair in the living room, a cup of tea in hand. She jumped up when she saw me. "Terry, what are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" Her voice was urgent, her eyes scanning my disheveled state, from my disheveled hair to my smoke-stained jacket. My father appeared from the hallway, his shirt rumpled, his face bewildered. "What's going on, Terry? Why do you look like that?" He approached, his voice tight, as if he could sense an approaching storm. I didn't answer, didn't stop. Anger was driving me, and I hurried up the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of a lifetime of suppressed grievances and injustices. Grayson's room was at the end of the hall, the room that had been mine as a child. I pushed open the door without knocking and saw him sprawled on the bed, phone in hand, playing a game. The screen's light illuminated his impassive, uncaring face. "Did you pour gasoline on my house?" I growled, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. My voice was icy, echoing in the small room, an irrevocable, deadly accusation. Grayson grinned, his eyes sneering, but I caught a fleeting glimmer of panic behind them. "Do you have any proof?" he asked. "Don't frame me," he said calmly, but I knew he was faking it, lying. He knew I knew. My mother rushed up the stairs, a worried expression on her face. "Terry, why are you yelling? What's going on?" She looked at me, then at Grayson. Her eyes were trembling as if she refused to believe something was terribly wrong. My dad appeared right behind him, his arms crossed, that stern, judgmental expression he always wore whenever I dared to disrupt our family's false harmony. "What's going on? My house is destroyed, Mom." My voice trembled with anger. "Everything I built, everything I own, is now a pile of ashes. And this man," I pointed at Grayson, my hand shaking, "he did it. I know he did it." Grayson jumped to his feet, throwing his phone on the bed. "You're crazy, Terry. You have no proof, and you come accusing me." He stalked toward me, his eyes bloodshot like a cornered animal. "You always think you're better than me, don't you? Perfect big brother. But what's the matter with you? Did you have a house? Well, that's gone now." He grinned wryly, his voice shaking, but I could see his hands were shaking slightly. He was scared. My mother intervened, positioning herself between us like a shield, her hands gripping Grayson's shoulders as if he were a small child in need of protection. Terry, calm down. You can't blame your brother like that. If the house burned down, you'd file an insurance claim. Please don't make a big deal out of this. Our family has suffered enough." Her voice trembled, as if she were trying to convince herself that everything could still be saved, that this terrible truth could be covered up. Insurance? I almost laughed, but it came out a bitter, pained laugh. "Mom, I lost everything. Not just a house, but my whole life. Did you ever ask me if I was okay? Do you even care? Or are you busy protecting your precious little boy like always?" I pointed at Grayson, my voice trembling, unable to control myself anymore. "He burned my house down, Mom. I know. Grandma heard him talking about getting gas." My father stepped forward, his voice stern and commanding. "Enough, Terry. Stop making trouble. Grayson is your brother. You have no proof, so don't make these accusations. Family comes first. Don't let this tear us apart." He looked at me with cold, emotionless eyes, as if I were the traitor, the one who had disturbed the family's peace. I stood there, as if the entire world had conspired against me. Not a word of comfort, not a single question about how I was doing. The same blind defense, the same injustice, as always. But this time, I wouldn't stay silent. The anger, the pain, the deep wound of years of being ignored exploded inside me like a fire engulfing my home. Family? What family, Dad? The family that always pushed me aside, ignored me? The family that treated the monster who burned down his own brother's house as their other son? I sacrificed everything for this family and no one noticed. No one cared. I shouted, my voice cracking with pain. Grayson grinned, moving closer to me. "What do you know about sacrifice anyway? All you do is show off, Terry. You had a house, a job, and I had nothing. You didn't help me, and now you have to face the consequences." His words were like an unspoken confession, blurted out. I saw my mother's eyes twitch, her wince at what she was hearing, but she held on tight, as if afraid that if she let go, the full truth would come out. "The consequences I'll face?" I repeated, my voice low, sharp as a knife. "You burned my house down, Grayson. You poured the gasoline, you lit the match, and you watched it burn. Do you think I didn't know? My grandmother heard you talking about the gasoline, about making me pay for it." I took a few steps closer to him, my eyes locked on his. I wanted him to confess, to face this terrible truth. Grayson took a step back, his eyes blazing with panic, but he quickly regained his sarcastic tone. "You're crazy, Terry. You have no proof. You're just a pathetic loser standing there screaming." But his voice was trembling, and I knew I was getting too close to the truth. My mother burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "Terry, Grayson, please stop. Why are you two doing this? We're family." She looked at me, then at Grayson, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't stop. Not now. My father stepped forward and put a hand on my mother's shoulder, his gaze still cold and fixed on me. "Terry, go home. Don't make this worse. We'll deal with this later." But I knew full well that by deal with it, he meant, as always, sweeping the truth under the rug. I shook my head and finally tears began to stream down my cheeks, not from weakness, but from a pain so great I could no longer suppress it. "No, Dad, I won't let you cover this up this time." I turned and left the room. My mother's voice called after me, but I didn't turn around. The anger inside me wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a volcano ready to erupt, about to spew its lava. Every step I took was heavy, carrying the crushing weight of a lifetime of being ignored and betrayed. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I couldn't breathe in a place where the truth was systematically buried under the guise of family. But I didn't leave immediately. I walked down the familiar hallway, past the family photos hanging on the walls. Those fake smiles were masks hiding years of injustice. The door to my grandmother's room was slightly ajar, a soft yellow light seeping in. I knocked softly. "Grandma, it's me, Terry." "Come in, Terry." My grandmother's voice was weak but warm, like a beacon guiding me through this darkness. I pushed open the door and saw her sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes sparkling when she saw me. The small room with its single bed, the quilt she'd knitted herself, and the family photos on the table still smelled of old wood and her favorite lavender. I closed the door and sat in the wooden chair next to her bed, the same chair where I'd listened to her stories about my grandfather, the hard times they'd overcome. But tonight, I was no longer the little boy who'd listened to those stories. I was a broken man seeking comfort from her in the midst of the storm. "I heard everything," she said in a trembling voice, her delicate hands clasping mine. "You did the right thing, Terry. Don't let them weaken you. Don't let them silence you. Grayson has gone too far this time." Her eyes shone with a deep pain, as if she were suffering with me. I bowed my head, and the tears began to flow again. But I didn't want her to see me weak. "Grandma, I've lost everything," I whispered, my voice trembling. "My home, my memories, everything. And it's all because of her, my mom and dad. They're protecting her, just like they always have." I squeezed her hand, feeling the gentle warmth of her trembling fingers. "I'm so tired, Grandma. I don't know what to do anymore." My words were a confession that exposed the bleeding wounds I'd kept hidden for years. Grandma gently caressed my hand, her gaze fixed as if she wanted to pour all her strength into me. "You're not alone, Terry," she said, her voice slow but firm. "If your grandfather were still here, he would be proud of you. You were always strong, always sacrificing. But this time, you have to fight for yourself, not for your house." He reached into a small drawer beside him and pulled out an old, worn-at-the-edges photograph. It was taken on the shores of Lake Michigan. I was standing between him and my grandfather, a carefree smile on my face, the summer sun shining. "We're always here for you," he said as he pressed the photo into my hands. "Don't let Grayson take you away from who you are." I held the photo tightly, my fingers running over my grandfather's face, the man he'd always said I was like, hard-working and patient, but never one to bow to injustice. My tears dripped onto the photo, but this time I held them back. "I'll do it, Grandma," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "I won't let him win." He nodded, his eyes shining with pride but also filled with worry. "Now go, Terry. Get your justice, but take care of yourself." I hugged her tightly, feeling her delicate warmth as a last source of strength before I went into battle. I left her room with that photo in my pocket like a talisman. As I left my parents' house, I didn't look back. My mother's weak, desperate voice echoed from the distance. The anger still burned within me, but now it was blended with a cold, steely resolve. I thought about how we'd been compared for years, how I'd been ignored, how I'd been forced to submit to Grayson simply because he was the little brother. Looking back at my childhood, I saw myself again, that little boy, always trying to please my parents, always striving to be the perfect big brother. I remembered giving Grayson the new bike I'd bought him after working an extra month, and him smirking and calling me the best big brother. But that smile never lasted. I remembered my parents buying him the newest shoes and me wearing worn, torn shoes. I remembered working part-time jobs since I was 16, bringing in money while Grayson squandered it, causing trouble constantly, and being protected by our parents. My mother always said, even though we were only a few years apart, "He's still so young." "You have to love your brother, Terry," my father would always remind me, as if my love were never enough. My grandmother's words had guided me through those dark days. When I complained about being compared to Grayson and I sat next to her, she'd said, "You're strong. But strong doesn't mean you have to endure everything forever." Those words were etched into my mind, a reminder that I deserved to be seen, to be loved. But my parents never saw that. To them, Grayson had always been a child to be protected and pampered, while I was the one who had to make every sacrifice to carry the burden. Now, that house burning down was the final straw. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of the years of sweat and tears I'd shed, proving I could survive without any of my family's support. Grayson had burned that house down, and with it, he'd destroyed the last shred of faith I had in my so-called family. But I wouldn't fall. My grandmother's words, that photo in my pocket, and everything I'd endured silently for years now, fanned a new flame within me, a determination to get justice at any cost. My heart heavy but my mind clearer than ever, I walked back to Alan's house. It was late, but Milwaukee was still awake, the dim streetlights casting a yellow, melancholy light on the empty streets. I parked in front of Alan's small apartment and knocked on the door. He opened the door and looked at me with eyes full of understanding. "Are you okay, Terry?" His voice was filled with concern. He took in my condition in an instant. Smoke-stained clothes, bloodshot eyes, a face contorted with pain. I'm not okay, I answered, not recognizing my own voice, and then I told him everything. The fire, the confrontation with Grayson, my family's reaction, and my grandmother's words. Alan listened without interrupting, simply nodding, then patted my shoulder. I know how much you're hurting, brother, but you need proof. If Grayson did this, you can't let your emotions get the best of you. I know someone who can help. I frowned at him. Who? Victor Ramirez, Alan said with conviction. A well-known, skilled private investigator in Milwaukee. He helped a friend of mine find concrete evidence in a complex burglary case. If anyone can dig up information on Grayson, it's Ramirez. Alan rummaged through his phone, found a number, and handed it to me. Call him. But you have to stay calm. Don't let your anger get to you. I nodded, took the number, and felt a faint glimmer of light at the end of that dark tunnel. Thanks, Alan, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know what I'd do without you. Alan smiled softly and patted my shoulder again. You're my brother, Terry. I'm always here. That night, I lay on Alan's couch and stared at the ceiling. I had a photo of my grandparents in my pocket, a reminder that I wasn't alone, but sleep wouldn't come to me. The image of my burning house, along with Grayson's sarcastic smile with every blaze, replayed over and over in my mind. I thought of Grayson, of the momentary panic in his eyes during our argument. He knew I knew, but he also knew I had no proof. My family, as always, had chosen him. The next day, I took time off work to deal with everything. I couldn't sit in front of a computer screen and pretend to focus on circuit diagrams when my entire world had been reduced to ash. I drove past my burned-out house, my heart breaking at the sight of the charred remains of years of memories. Blackened debris lay scattered like the shards of a shattered life. A lone piece of charred wood lay on the ground. I stopped the car, got out, and picked it up, my fingers tracing its rough, sooty surface. Pain stabbed into my chest like a knife. This wasn't just a house. It was evidence of years of sweat and tears. It was my only place of peace, my only breathing place amidst family storms. Now it was nothing but blackened, painful memories. I stood there in the late autumn Milwaukee cold, the wind blowing ashes around me like restless ghosts. I clenched my jaw and held back the tears. I put the piece of wood in my pocket, making a silent vow to get justice, not just for the house, but for everything that had been stolen from me. My phone vibrated, breaking me from my thoughts. It was a text from Cynthia, a close colleague at work. Terry, I heard what happened at your house. Are you okay? Please let me know if you need anything. Her concern touched me, but I smiled wryly, realizing that the kindness of my friends now meant more than any words from my family. Thank you, I'm okay. I'll let you know if I need anything, I replied simply. But I knew I wasn't okay. I was just trying to stay upright, trying to keep the anger and pain from engulfing me completely. I went to the office of Angela Whitmore, a well-known attorney in the area. Her office was in a small building on Wisconsin Avenue with an unassuming sign that bore her name. When I walked in, Angela, a middle-aged woman with neatly styled silver hair, greeted me with a firm handshake. I'm Terry, I said, trying to hide my nervousness. Alan told me about your situation. Please sit down, she said, her voice warm but also direct. Tell me everything from the beginning. I sat down across from him and told him everything. The argument with Grayson, my grandmother's warning, the fire, and the confrontation at my parents' house that night. I told him about the smell of gasoline, the momentary panic in Grayson's eyes, and how my parents had protected him. Angela listened with her sharp but understanding gaze, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she nodded and put her pen down. Terry, from what you've told me, this fire was definitely not an accident. The smell of gasoline is a clear sign of arson. The police will investigate, but I have to warn you. Sometimes, especially without outside pressure, they handle these kinds of cases sketchily. I frowned, my heart pounding. Sketchy? What do you mean? He sighed solemnly. The police have a lot of files, and if there's no clear evidence or public pressure, they might just call it an accident and close the case quickly. If you want justice, you need to gather more evidence. Security footage, witnesses, anything that can place Grayson at the scene. If we can provide enough evidence, we might be able to pressure the police into taking action, maybe even take this case to trial. Her words were a cold shower, but they were also a glimmer of hope. I nodded, trying to find my voice. I understand. I will find evidence. Angela smiled slightly and handed me her business card. Call me if you need legal advice, but please be careful. If your brother is as dangerous as you say, you need to stay safe. I left her office feeling both empowered and burdened. Angela had shown me a path, but she had also reminded me how challenging the road ahead would be. I needed evidence and someone to help me find it. That's when I remembered Victor Ramirez, the private investigator Alan had mentioned. Sitting in my car, I pulled out my phone, took a deep breath, and dialed Victor Ramirez's number. My heart was pounding as the phone rang. We chatted briefly, and Victor agreed to meet at a small cafe on Lincoln Avenue. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe. I sat in the corner, my coffee cup spinning, my eyes fixed on the door. Victor Ramirez walked in just in time, a tall, thin man of middle age, wearing a worn leather jacket and a baseball cap. His eyes were sharp, as if he could see through every secret, every lie. "Terry," he asked, his voice low but friendly. "Yes, that's me," I replied, standing to shake his hand. His grip was tight, like someone used to handling difficult cases. We sat down, and I told him everything in great detail. The argument with Grayson, my grandmother's warning, the fire, and the confrontation that night. Victor listened quietly, nodding occasionally, and making a few notes in a small notebook. "The gasoline, the threats, and your grandmother as a witness," he said calmly. "That's a good start, but it's not enough to build a case. We need concrete evidence." I nodded, knowing it wouldn't be easy. "Can you find it?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Victor smiled slightly, his eyes firm. "I've handled tougher cases than this, but you'll have to be patient." "Thank you," I said, finding my voice. "I just want the truth." Victor nodded and handed me his business card. "I'll get started right away. Give me a few days to check the security cameras and talk to the neighbors. I'll be in touch." I left the cafe feeling like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but the pain still lingered in my heart like an unhealed wound. I went to a small apartment complex near my work that I'd temporarily rented. The apartment was small and plain, with bare white walls, but it was the perfect place to start over. In the days that followed, I tried to live a normal life, but falling asleep was nearly impossible. Night after night, I tossed and turned in my bed, haunted by images of the fire, Grayson's mocking laughter, and my family's cold staircase. But I also received messages of support from friends and colleagues, Cynthia, Alan, and a few others. They called, asked how I was, invited me to dinner, and reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. For the first time, I realized that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who truly care about you. A week later, Victor called. "Terry, I have something," he said, his voice calm but hopeful. "A gas station camera near your house recorded Grayson and two of his friends getting gas that night. A neighbor's security camera also caught the license plate of his car driving through the neighborhood shortly before the fire. It's not strong enough to stand trial yet, but it's a good start. Would you like me to investigate further?" My heart pounding, I grabbed the phone. "Go ahead, Victor," I said firmly. "I want the truth, the whole truth." Victor agreed, and I hung up. In the days I waited for Victor's results, I continued working, handling insurance paperwork and cooperating with the police, but the slow pace of the police was infuriating. I'd get occasional texts from my mother, pleading, "Terry, come home, we need to talk." But I didn't answer. I couldn't go back to a place where the truth was systematically buried. I thought about Grayson, how he'd destroyed everything I'd built, and how my family had always chosen him. But I also thought of my grandmother, Alan, Victor, and those people who stood by me. They were my strength, my reason to keep going. I stood in front of the mirror in my new apartment, staring at my tired face. I was no longer that patient boy, the brother who always sacrificed. I was Terry, a man determined to get justice not just for my home, but for myself. The photo of my grandparents on the table was a reminder. I wasn't alone, and I would fight. Thanksgiving, a family reunion, would be the moment I'd show Grayson's true colors to the people who had always protected him. I clutched that photo in my inside jacket pocket, its frayed edges like an oath, and with anger tempered by cold determination, I walked out the door. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, I worked tirelessly with Victor Ramirez. He sent me copies of the gas station camera footage of Grayson and his two friends getting gas on the night of the fire. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. There it was. Grayson in his familiar gray hoodie, holding a gas can. His eyes were hot and restless, like a guilty man's. There was also a written statement from my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, who had seen Grayson's car drive through the neighborhood just before the fire broke out. Victor's concise yet incisive report clearly outlined the timeline and evidence linking Grayson to the fire. It might not be enough to warrant a verdict yet, but it would be enough to shatter the protective wall my family had built around him. Thanksgiving arrived, and Milwaukee was blanketed in a freezing cold, the wind carrying the harsh breath of winter through the streets. My hands gripped the steering wheel, the evidence file tucked away in the bag on the passenger seat, and I drove to my parents' house. I wanted them to see Grayson not as the precious little son they'd spoiled, but as the monster who'd ruined my life. The house was brightly lit, and the familiar, warm smell of roast turkey and pumpkin pie wafted from the kitchen. Laughter and conversation filled the air, as if everything was still normal, as if my house hadn't been reduced to a pile of ashes. I pushed open the door, dressed simply but elegantly, clutching the bag containing the damned evidence. My mother was setting the table, and her face brightened for a moment when she saw me, but that light quickly turned to concern when she noticed my stern expression. "Terry, you're home," she said, trying to sound cheerful, but her eyes were trembling. "Come in, dinner's almost ready." My dad was sitting at the head of the table, slicing into the turkey and glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. "You're just in time," he said, his voice calm, but his eyes wary, as if sensing an approaching storm. Grayson appeared on the stairs, his hoodie disheveled again, and he grinned wryly when he saw me. "Wow, our big brother's here too," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you here to ruin Thanksgiving?" My grandmother, sitting in her wheelchair at the corner of the table, glared at me as if she knew why I was there. I took a deep breath, set the bag on a chair, and sat up straighter. "I'm not here to eat," I said, my voice low but firm, echoing like a whip through the suddenly quiet room. All eyes turned to me, the air heavy with the tension of an approaching storm. "I'm here to talk about what happened, about my house and how it was burned down." I locked eyes with Grayson, watching him stiffen as his gaze flickered with unease. My mother stood abruptly, gripping the tablecloth, her voice trembling. "Terry, it's Thanksgiving. Please don't be so tense. We are family. Sit down and eat." She moved closer to me as if to pull me into a chair, but her eyes were trembling as if she were afraid of what I was about to say. "Family?" I repeated, my voice icy. Pain surged through my chest. "What family, Mom? The family who let me lose everything and are still protecting the person who did it?" I opened the bag, took out the folder, and spread its contents out on the dining room table, just in front of the turkey platter. This is a copy of the gas station surveillance footage of Grayson and his friends getting gas that night. I held out a printed photo to my parents, Grayson's face clearly visible in the dim light of the station. This is a written statement from our neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, saying Grayson's car drove through the neighborhood just before the fire, and this is a private investigator's report that confirms every detail. My dad looked at the evidence, his face darkened. He slammed his hand on the table so hard it shook the wine glasses. His voice was like thunder. "Terry, enough. You have no right to accuse your brother like that. It's Thanksgiving. Do you want to ruin everything?" He stood, wagging his finger at me, his eyes burning, as if I were the one betraying their family. "You have no hard evidence, only this nonsense. Do you want to tear this family apart?" The unceasing pain inside me erupted like the fire that had engulfed my home. "Tear it apart?" I screamed, tears welling up, but I bit my lip and held it back. "Dad, I lost everything. My home, my memories, everything I'd built. Grayson burned it all down, and you and Mom, like always, are standing here protecting him." My hands were shaking with anger, and I pointed at Grayson. "Tell me, Grayson. Look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't do it." My voice trailed off, out of control. But I didn't care. No matter how much it hurt, I wanted the truth. Grayson jumped to his feet, his chair falling back with a crash. "You're crazy, Terry," he shouted, his face red, his hands clenched, You have nothing. You're just a pathetic loser screaming for attention." But his voice trembled, his eyes darted away, and I knew he was afraid. He leaned closer and wagged his finger at me. "Do you think you can destroy me? You're nothing. I just wanted you to know what it's like to lose everything like I did." The words were like an uncontrollable confession, spilling from his mouth, and the room was suddenly plunged into stunned silence. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Grayson, are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling as if her heart had just been shattered. She backed away, leaning against the wall, her hands trembling, her gaze darting between me and Grayson. She wanted to deny it, to believe her precious little boy couldn't have done this. But Grayson's words tore through that protective veil. "No, it can't be," he muttered, but his voice was weak, as if he were just trying to convince himself. My father was frozen, his hands still on the table, his face rigid, his eyes shifting between anger and shock. "Grayson, what did you just say?" he asked, his voice low but shaky, as if he didn't want to believe what he was hearing. He looked at me, then at Grayson, and for the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Did you really do this?" he asked, his voice trembling. It wasn't the commanding, authoritative tone I'd grown accustomed to. Grayson stumbled, took a step back, breathing deeply. I didn't mean it," he stammered, his eyes wide, but no one in the room believed him anymore. He stormed out of the room, pushed my mother aside, and ran up the stairs, leaving the family in a stunned, heavy silence. My grandmother glared at me from the corner of the table, her lips pressed tightly together, her gaze seeming to say, "You did it." My heart was pounding, not with anger this time, but with bitter relief. The truth had finally come out, at least partially, but the pain was still there, aching like an unhealed wound. I looked at Mom and saw her slumped in a chair, her hands clasped together, sobbing. "Terry, I didn't know. I didn't want to believe it," she said, her voice hoarse, like an apology, though I wasn't sure if it stemmed from her blind faith in Grayson or from all those years she'd ignored me. Dad stood, but his shoulders were slumped, his eyes blank. I spoke to him, my voice low, but tears streaming down my cheeks. "Dad, this family fell apart the moment you and Mom chose Grayson. When you left me in those ashes without a word of comfort, I didn't destroy our family. I just wanted justice for myself." I turned to my grandmother, saw her nod slightly, her eyes filled with pride. I gathered the file and left the house. My mother's voice echoed behind me, but I didn't stop. I drove off into the night, my heart heavy yet light. I had succeeded. I had forced Grayson to reveal his true self, forced my family to face that painful truth. But the pain hadn't subsided. I thought of my mother, her tears, her shocked, devastated expression when Grayson disappeared. I thought of my father, the sinking in his eyes, the fact that he was no longer the authoritarian father who had dominated me. And I thought of Grayson, how he had escaped, but I knew he couldn't escape forever. A few days later, Victor called me, his voice filled with excitement. "Terry, the police just reached out. They've opened a formal investigation. An investigation into Grayson for arson and property damage. The video, the witness statements, and especially his implicit confession in front of your family have forced them to act. He was called in for questioning this morning." My heart pounded, and I clutched the phone tightly. "Really?" I asked, my voice trembling with disbelief. "What happens now?" "They'll investigate further," Victor replied. "There's a very good chance he'll be charged. With the evidence we have, Grayson will face serious legal consequences, but you should prepare yourself. These kinds of cases can drag on." I nodded, in a way Victor couldn't see. "Thanks, Victor. I don't know how I'm going to repay you." He chuckled softly. "Just live well, Terry. It's the best way to repay a debt." News about Grayson spread quickly through our small Milwaukee community. Neighbors who had always thought of my parents as the model of a perfect middle-class family began to whisper. Stanley and Betty let their youngest son burn down his brother's house. They always protected that kid. Now look at the consequences. The murmurs were like a cold wind blowing through the facade of respectability my parents had built over the years. They had lost their respectability. They were no longer the respectable couple in the neighborhood. I heard that my mother had taken a break from her schoolwork, and my father had avoided his usual neighborhood gatherings. They had been forced to face the truth. Their blind favoritism had led to disaster. I didn't contact my family again after Thanksgiving. My mother's texts kept coming, pleading, "Terry, come home, we need to talk." But I didn't respond. I'd given them too many chances, sacrificed too many years to be ignored. This time, I chose myself. I decided to cut ties with them, not out of anger, but because I needed time to heal. I needed to rebuild my life from the ashes, and I couldn't do that while being sucked back into my family's toxic vortex. One afternoon, I visited my grandmother. She was still at my parents' house, but I knew she was the one person I couldn't leave behind. When I entered her room, the soft yellow light cast a glow across her face. She looked older, but her eyes still sparkled with that same resilience. She held my hand, her delicate fingers trembling but warm. "You did it, Terry," she said, her voice weak but filled with pride. "You're not that little boy who had to endure everything in silence anymore." I leaned over and hugged her tightly, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I couldn't have done it without you," I whispered, my voice hoarse. She patted me on the back, as she did when I was a child, and said, "You're so much stronger than you know, Terry. Your grandfather would have been so proud of you." Her words were like a beacon, illuminating the path ahead, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my life. I bought a small house in the Milwaukee suburbs, modest but warm enough to call it home. I went to work every day, immersed myself in my work, and found peace again in the numbers and the wires. Cynthia and Alan had become indispensable friends, always inviting me to dinner or baseball games, reminding me that I had a new family, made up of people I wasn't related to by blood but who genuinely cared about me. According to Victor, Grayson had been formally charged with arson and criminal damage. The case was still open, but with the mounting evidence, I knew he wouldn't escape the consequences. I didn't feel triumphant, just a bittersweet sense of relief. Grayson had dug his own grave, and I had simply done what I should have done long ago, stood up for myself. One evening, I sat in my new home, staring at the photo of my grandparents on the table. I thought about my journey from a boy trying to please his parents to a man who dared to face the truth, no matter how painful. I thought of my grandmother's lesson, now more clear than ever. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't outside, but right within the family. Justice and honor belong to those who dare to stand up for themselves. One quiet night, I sat alone in my new home. The soft yellow light illuminated the photo of my grandparents on the table. It was like a flare shining on the wounds in my heart. I thought about my journey from that little boy, always trying to please his parents, to a man who dares to face the truth, no matter how painful. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind like a clear message. Sometimes danger comes not from the outside world, but from those we love most, those we call family. But justice and honor belong to those who dare to stand tall, fight, and speak out the truth, even if it costs them their entire world.